Dobry wieczór, guten Abend, good evening. I think we can start. I was also told to announce that those of you who need simultaneous translation into German, you can take the devices over there. It's provided, I'm sorry about those who cannot enter due to the safety fire rules in this space, but it's really a great pleasure to see so many people tonight, and it's indeed our great honor to welcome all of you at the opening of the Kyiv Biennial edition in Berlin, titled Kyiv Perennial. My name is Vasil Cherepanin. I represent the Visual Culture Research Center, which is the organizer of the Kyiv Biennial. And we are launching today actually the discursive program of the whole project. And it's really a great honor to have a world-famous historian, Timothy Snyder, with a keynote tonight. So using this opportunity, I would like to express our deep, deep thankfulness that you, Professor Snyder, so kindly agreed to come and take part. And the exhibition opening of the Kyiv Biennial in Berlin will take place exactly in a week time, just next door at nGbK, next Friday at 6. So the Kyiv Biennial in Berlin is titled not by occasion Kyiv Perennial, because the notion of perenniale is very much about time. And time is a crucial notion, especially today for history, but also is a crucial factor in war, and it's a crucial idea for Ukraine and as well as for Europe at the moment. And we decided to title this Kyiv Biennial in Berlin that way because the idea of perennial has a multidimensional meaning. On the one hand, quite literally, it means multi-year period, and this biennial in Berlin is actually literally a follow-up of the Kyiv Biennial 23, which we started in October last year, and which was taking place in a number of Ukrainian as well as EU cities. But symbolically, perennial means also lasting, existing for a long or apparently infinite time, enduring, persisting, and it seems like this ability to persist and last in spite of all obstacles is perhaps the best characteristics of Ukraine at the moment. So I would like to express my deep, deep thankfulness to all the institutional partners here in Berlin who made it possible, nGbK, Between Bridges, Prater Galerie, and the Kulturstiftung des Bundes, because your trust, your kind support, and your political dedication and readiness to embark on this endeavor is really unbelievably crucial, so valuable, very unique, and it's really very important for our common Ukrainian and European cause. And for that matter, I would also like to express my thankfulness to all my fellow countrymen, to all the Ukrainians, because it is exactly thanks to the Ukrainian resistance, not only over the last 2 years, but throughout the last 10 years, that we are able to gather here tonight, though in such a tragic time. So perennial is very much, The idea of perennial is very much about place in time that we are currently in. And I find it especially important and, again, symbolic that we are opening the Kyiv Biennial here on Berlin Central Square, exactly in this place, on Alexanderplatz. And for that matter, I am a bit even tempted to reformulate Alfred Doblin and say Maidan Alexanderplatz. And we are opening it exactly these days, as we put it, marking the 10th anniversary of the Maidan Revolution and the 10th year of Russia's war against Ukraine. And for us, as the Kyiv Biennial, this is, of course, not just some topicality, as you can imagine. It is an endeavor on an existential ground of political, social, and cultural survival. But this so-called anniversary, this date, it's not just some round date. It actually reveals a very fundamental dimension that we have to draw the lesson from in order to understand our current political and social predicament that we in Europe are currently in. It seems like a simple fact when we say that it's 10th year of Maidan and 10th year of war, but how come that we have a revolution and the war in the same so-called time package? Because both notions are, of course, defining concepts for history, but this aspect also tells a lot about the specificity of this revolution and the specificity of this war. Because as you perhaps all know, that Russia launched its military invasion of Ukraine in 2014, exactly literally on the same day, the 22nd of February, when Maidan revolution was victorious. And so this war, from its very beginning, has been a counter-revolution at its purest. So in a way we can say that the whole country, which is now called Russian Federation, became a kind of an anti-Maidan. And this ideological nature of Russia's war as counter-revolutionary is actually based on pseudo-historical ressentiment, regressing frustration, and political reaction, as the very idea of revolution has been always the biggest fear of the current Kremlin regime. And at the same time, Maidan was rightly called the Euromaidan, the European Revolution, but not only in Ukrainian sense, not only in a national sense, but also an international one, because it was the last European revolution so far, and a successful one. And Maidan was definitely aimed at Europe. It actually demonstrated that what we call United Europe today is in fact a very radical idea, that it's not just some metaphysical resort for culture, but it is based on a very radical, indeed a revolutionary premise, a very radical declaration. And because what we call United Europe today is actually what comes after as a way out when the European Western empires collapsed. And this is exactly why it is a real nightmare for Russian revanchist imperialism, because the Russia's war is fundamentally anti-European, because it is exactly this anti-imperial nature of United Europe that the Kremlin regime is so frightened with. And that's why this war is actually aimed not only at Ukraine, but at disrupting the very political and institutional order of the whole Europe, which was established as the main outcome of the Nazi defeat. And again today, Europe is facing fascism, or rather state fascist regime. In spite of all, never again. And when 2 years ago I first read of Zeitenwende, I was actually constantly thinking, why was it proclaimed only in 22? Why wasn't it Maidan, an emancipatory claim of a new, more just and bigger Europe, called that way? Why Zeitenwende was declared because of a genocidal assault on a country? Why was it the war catastrophe that called that way? What does it tell about current state of Europe at the moment? And how could that happen, right? That it's such an unthinkable, totally ruthless genocidal war of a totally unbelievable scale that it's even hard to pronounce these words today. Perhaps it's because that the so-called European Erinnerungskultur is actually lacking a proper political and historical Gedächtnis. Indeed, over the last 10 years, or even longer, I would say, what we've been having in Europe was definitely not a Zeitenwende, but a Zeitverschwendung, a waste of time. Because Ukraine has been presenting precious political gifts for Europe. several times for the European renewal, but they have been left aside and ignored as Europe as such wasn't ready to live up to its tasks. First, 20 years ago in 2004 with the Orange Revolution, the so-called First Maidan. Then 10 years ago, 2014, with the Euromaidan Revolution. And then 2 years ago in 22, when Ukraine survived not only and sustained itself as a country, but actually saved the whole European order, as we have it at least at the moment. So if there is any fundamental lesson, political lesson that we can be drawn from Maidan, I would say that this is the following one. It is that an unused or a lost revolutionary chance, a chance for renewal, for liberation, for emancipation, if it's lost, it turns to its ideological opposite. And we have experienced it over the last years, not only in the form of the Russian genocidal war against Ukraine, but also internationally with the rise of all kinds of fascistoid or outright fascist regimes, authoritarian regimes, totalitarian powers across the whole world. And it is especially important to keep this in mind exactly in this year, so-called election year of 2024, because as Ukraine is now, in fact, buying time for Europe, paying an immense price literally every day while we speak, it is still the best chance for Europe, not only in the sense of the Ukrainian future in the United Europe, but also for the future of the very survival of the European idea, the very form of United Europe itself. And it will be indeed the biggest European tragedy since its inception after the Second World War, if Europe simply slips, lets this chance slips through the fingers. It simply doesn't and won't have any other chance in the foreseeable future. So tonight, it's especially great pleasure and honor to have Professor Timothy Snyder with us, perhaps the best historian thanks to whom Europe can learn from the Ukrainian history as well as from the Ukrainian present. And using this opportunity, let me again, dear Professor Snyder, express our deep, deep thankfulness to you that you kindly came here tonight. I would say it won't be an exaggeration that the whole Ukraine, the Ukrainian society, the Kyiv Perennial itself would be in a much more worse condition without you. As I remember very well that we, as a visual culture research center, were reopening after Maidan together with you. In 2015, we were starting the very first edition of the Kyiv Perennial also with you, and it's really a great honor that we are able to launch the Kyiv Perennial here in Berlin also with you. So, Timothy Snyder is a Richard Levin Professor of History at Yale University and also a permanent fellow at the Institute for Human Sciences in Vienna. Professor Snyder's books include, just to name a few, The Reconstruction of Nations, Poland, Ukraine, Lithuania, Belarus, Bloodlands, Europe between Hitler and Stalin, Black Earth, the Holocaust as History and Warning, On Tyranny, 20 Lessons from the 20th Century, The Road to Unfreedom, Russia, Europe, America. Now Professor Snyder is working on his book on freedom, which, if I'm not mistaken, is upcoming later this year. His work has appeared in 40 languages. He received a number of different international prizes. He also himself appeared in documentaries, films. He also inspired many cultural events, including our own one. He was quoted in political demonstrations across the world. So please give the Professor Snyder a very warm welcome. Thank you so much.
So tonight, after this is over, I have to get on a train and go to Munich and talk about power. I came here this evening to talk to you about art, and that's what I'll be doing. I'm happy to answer questions later about power, but because what we're doing is we're inaugurating a festival about art, I'm going to do my best to talk about art. I want to thank Vasil for the very kind introduction, and of course the nGbK and other partners for inviting me. Vasil made the very important point about gifts, referred to the very important concept of gifts. I think it's a bit of a lost art in Western culture anyway, to know how to receive a gift. And I think part of the problem that we've had in Europe and North America with Ukraine is the difficulty of receiving gifts, the lost art of receiving a gift. And of course, you have to recognize a gift for what it is. And in some sense, that's going to be the theme of my lecture, recognizing when your culture has been given a gift. I want to thank Vasil as well and other colleagues and friends from Ukraine for continuing to make art these last 10 years. The years since the Maidan, the years since fall of 2013 have been incredibly beautiful years in Ukrainian culture, in poetry, in the visual arts, in filmmaking, in novels, in literature, in other domains. And it's in this spirit, I think, that one has to inaugurate a biennale or a perennial, that we do art despite everything, and we do art because of everything. There's a scene in my wife Marcy Shore's book, Caviar and Ashes, of the Polish poet Broniewski, who's in prison in the 1920s or the 1930s. And he walks through his cell reciting poetry the entire time. And the idea is, you've got views about the microphones. It's okay. Oh, okay. Sorry. I'm sorry. It was just, I told a whole series of jokes you've heard before. Okay. So the lecture really hasn't started. You're fine. But the point was that Broniewski, this poet, he would walk through the cell and recite poetry, and the idea that he was a poet despite everything. And I think if you are a poet, you're a poet despite everything. And if you're a historian, you're a historian despite everything, or because of everything. And the last 10 years that Vasil has spoken of, and also the last 2 years, I try as a thinker and as a historian to also receive as a gift. That is, to try to learn from Ukrainians and their experiences, and learn from my friends, and also to rethink some of the things that I thought before. So how do we in the West tend to think about Ukraine? I think we tend, when we think we're being generous, we're not receiving gifts, we're trying to give gifts. We're trying to say, oh, let's find a way that the Ukrainians are like us. Or let's find a way where their history fits into Western history, and then let's congratulate them for that. And I'm sure I've been guilty of both of those things. What I'm going to try to do this evening, in what I hope is really a lighthearted spirit, is to suggest some of the ways that Ukrainian history actually fits into Western culture in ways that are profound, if invisible. And I could do this for serious subjects too. And I did it for serious subjects last night for a very different demographic. That was meant to be a compliment to you. The funny thing about making jokes like that is that you're always taped, which means that the people from last night get to watch and be like, that wasn't nice. But what I mean to do this evening is to talk about two gigantic pieces of Western, or apparently Western, popular culture, and explain how they are indispensably, unavoidably linked to the history of Ukraine. So I have in mind, as you can tell from the title, I don't think Vasil mentioned it, but it's a very lighthearted title. The title was Wonder Woman and the Orcs, Ukrainian History and Western Fable. So the two giant pieces of our popular culture that I want to consider are the most important set of fantasy novels, so Tolkien and The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, and the most important superheroine in the canon, right? Wonder Woman. So on the surface, The Lord of the Rings is a piece of British culture, or even a piece of British imperial culture. Tolkien was a child of empire. He was born in South Africa. And on the surface, Wonder Woman is, of course, a story of American power. She arises right before the Second World War begins. She wears the American colors as her uniform. Or you might say, on the surface, these are no longer British or American figures or stories. These are international stories. These are global stories. They belong to everyone. What I want to try to say is that they may belong slightly more to Ukraine than they do to other people, in a way which may not be known, at least before this lecture, to the Ukrainians themselves. What I want to try to say is that neither of these pieces of culture could have arisen without historical events which actually took place in Ukraine. And what I also want to say is that the path that they took to becoming American or British or global culture runs through Ukraine in some fairly profound ways. I started thinking about this. I know I'm always supposed to be thinking about serious things, like this is the problem of my job description, but I'm not always thinking about serious things, or sometimes when I'm in a serious situation, I'm thinking about things which may not seem to be so serious. It's when you're shaken, when you're put in a situation which is slightly different, that the pieces that make up your own education, your own Bildung, start to move. Like the things that you learned when you were young and which seem to fit together in a certain order start to move around. And that's certainly been the case for me when I've spent time in wartime Ukraine, and especially in territories which had been occupied by Russia and then were deoccupied by the Ukrainian armed forces. I was in such a place last September in Kherson Oblast, and it was as though every day, every hour, every minute, every moment of the time that I spent on this trip was reorganizing in my mind things that I thought that I knew. So just to give you some examples before we get to the Orcs and Wonder Woman, on the drive from Kyiv to Odessa, which is a drive that, more people from Berlin should make more often. On the drive from Kyiv to Odessa, about halfway down as you pass Uman, just to the left of the highway, there is a little village called Nebelivka. And that village of Nebelivka is next door to what is perhaps the oldest city in the world. There were cities in what's now south-central Ukraine 6,000 to 7,000 years ago. These are the oldest known human settlements. People lived there at the same time as they lived in cities in ancient Mesopotamia, maybe earlier. Nebelivka is one of at least 10 such settlements. It's the only one which has been thoroughly studied. No one knows this, right? No one knows this, or very few people know this. The whole history of humans gathering in cities may actually begin in south-central Ukraine, and yet you can drive right by and not think about it. The way that you see, one of the ways you can see Nebelivka, and I was thinking about this because I was visiting sunflower farms, is that if you have a drone, which a lot of people in Ukraine now do, and you fly it over Nebelivka, which has been done at the right time of year, the sunflowers rise up from where there were houses 7,000 years ago, 3 days earlier than everywhere else. So an aerial photograph of this place will show you a map of houses where people lived thousands of years ago, displayed in sunflowers, right? Displayed in sunflowers. Another thing which got me thinking, or threw, my education into disarray and then rearranged it, was the language itself. So on these farms in Kherson Oblast, which I'm not going to define any more precisely for obvious reasons, we were speaking Ukrainian, and the the men and women on the farms referred to the Russian occupiers by various terms. One of the terms which they used was rasisty, and which on the surface, it's a very useful word because it means Russian fascist. And, we could all use a word for Russian fascist. I quite agree with Vasil that fascism is a very useful category in the 2020s. But rashisti, rashismus, is actually a play on words which involves things about the Russian language, the Ukrainian language, the English language, as well as Italian, which it would take me a whole other lecture to explain, so I'm not going to. The New York Times did let me write 4,000 words about it. So if you want to look it up, it's there. But when Pani Helena, one of the women who I met, spoke of rashisti, that got me thinking about our languages, our Ukrainian, our Russian, our Italian, our English, all of these Indo-European languages. Indo-European is a big category. It includes Sanskrit and Hindi, as it includes the languages spoken by about half the people in the world. It appears now to be very close to a sure thing that the homeland of Indo-European languages is the Ukrainian steppe, what's now the Ukrainian steppe. So insofar as people are communicating with each other in the world anywhere using Hindi or English or German, French, Ukrainian, they are in some sense connected. Your neural networks are connected historically to pastoralists about 5,000 and 6,000 years ago in the Ukrainian steppe. This is just getting started, right? I haven't gotten to Wonder Woman yet. But I hope that what I'm trying to show is that there are very basic things about who we are and where we come from, which indispensably have to do with Ukraine. Okay, rashisti is one way that the farm workers referred to Russian occupiers, because they're not all Russians by ethnicity anyway. The way that the men usually referred to the occupiers was orki. That was the casual way, orki, which of course in English is orcs. And it seems to be a reference to Tolkien. And of course, Tolkien, as all the Ukrainians will know, is a pretty universal topos in describing this war. I can remember, probably more universal than I realized, but I remember all the way back in 2013, 2014, Mordor being used as a description of a neighboring country. And in this war, there was an American fighting on the Ukrainian side who called himself Gimli, who was killed in action. There's a Russian leader who's concerned that too many Russian youth are registering themselves as elves in the Russian census and believes that learning Elvish is a threat to Russian national security. I'm not joking. That actually happened. You can look it up. In other words, there has been a certain amount of self-appropriation of the idea of being the orcs in the story. When Tucker Carlson went to talk to Putin, one of the ways that Ukrainians reacted was saying, that's a lot like going to Mordor to interview Sauron, right? That's one of the nicest ways to describe it. It's an available cultural way to describe it. Okay, so now that I've established that Tolkien is a very accessible cultural way of describing or providing a framework or a set of characters, it's a way of describing what's good and what's evil in this war. I want you to reflect with me a little bit about where that word came from and where Tolkien actually comes from and what Tolkien has to do in a pretty deep way with Ukraine. Here's the thesis, and then I'm going to flesh it out with details. Tolkien is writing in the genre of medieval Icelandic, Scandinavian sagas. He is very consciously writing in the genre or with the tools, the characters, the ideas, the plot devices of the stories that are associated with medieval Scandinavia. The Edda, as well as Beowulf, which is the earliest English story. He tells us that very directly. He tells us that. So in The Hobbit, I'm just going to assume that everybody who's here is here because they read The Hobbit and for no other reason. In The Hobbit, there are dwarves who are called things like dwelen. It's slightly different than what you're going to expect. Dvalen, Baffer, Bombor, Nori, Ori, Owen, Thorin, Fili, Kili, Glowen, Thror, Thrain, Dane, Nain. These are all from Sibyl's prophecy, which is from the early part of the Prose Edda. Tolkien tells us that he's writing an Icelandic story by taking the names of all of his dwarves, as well as Gandalf, from the most famous collection of Nordic myths. But it's not just that, it's the whole plot of The Hobbit, right? The whole plot of The Hobbit, the idea that there are dwarves, elves, and men, that comes from medieval Nordic culture. The idea that there's a man who can change himself into a bear whose name begins with B, that comes from medieval Nordic culture. The idea of a riddle contest. If you remember, in the middle of The Hobbit, Bilbo has a contest of riddles with a creature called Gollum, and at the end of the contest, Bilbo asks a riddle which is not really a riddle. That exact sequence of events takes place in the saga of King Hydric. The climax of the story, when Bilbo, as a thief, enters a dragon's lair and steals one object, a golden goblet, that's taken from the third part of Beowulf. So essentially everything that's in The Hobbit, in one way or another, comes from very well-known pieces of medieval, Old English or medieval Scandinavian literature. And I don't mean that Tolkien plagiarized it. I mean that Tolkien wanted his literature to be of a piece with this other literature, and that he wanted us to know it. The same goes, by the way, for the name of the place where The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings take place, Middle-earth. That phrase, Midgard, Middle-earth, appears in both Beowulf and in the Prose Edda, and Tolkien himself translates it as Middle-earth. So the universe, the whole world, is coming from medieval, Icelandic, Scandinavian, Old English culture. The same is true even more powerfully for the whole Lord of the Rings. The Lord of the Rings is constructed as part of medieval, Icelandic, Scandinavian culture. Dwarves, elves, and men. Dwarves who forge, elves who also forge, but in particular forge things of value for those who are very powerful. A main character who is called Strider. The most important man is called Strider, both in the Prose Edda and in Tolkien. There's a character, a king actually, in the Prose Edda who's called not Frodo, I admit, but Frodi. And in his story, there's a golden ring. Even Gandalf's horse, which those of you who really are the Tolkien fans here, and I'm trying to figure out who they are. I think they're like two people who are actually here for the Tolkien. But you'll remember that Gandalf's horse is called Shadowfax. Fax is Old Icelandic for mane. And so Shadowfax is a name of a horse like the names of horses that you find in the Icelandic myths. So pretty much everything, including the basic structure of the plot. In the Old Norse stories, there are three basic things that happen with rings. I'm sorry, if you don't know the plot of The Lord of the Rings, I feel really weird like stepping back to say what the plot of The Lord of the Rings is, but it involves a hobbit who inherits a ring of power and has to destroy it by dropping it into a mountain. Though there's one guy who didn't know, there was one person who was like, thanks, I saw him. Yeah. In the Norse mythology, two people actually, in the Norse mythology, there are rings that bind you. So I give you a ring, and that means that you are bound to me. So for example, in a very famous story called Hrolfkraki, a ring is given to someone, and that binds the someone to the king. The rings, by the way, in Norse mythology are not necessarily this sort of ring. They can be a ring more like the kind of ring that Wonder Woman wears, but I'll get to that later on. And that kind of ring, the ring that a lord uses to bind someone to him, appears in Hrolfkraki, it appears in Beowulf over and over and over again, and it was in fact normal true historical practice among the Vikings. The chief of a Viking lodge or clan, the person who organized the raiding expeditions, would reward his most loyal soldiers by giving them bands of silver and gold rings. So one way that rings appear in Norse mythology and Norse history is binding, right? A second is that they appear as a curse. In maybe the most important story in the Prose Edda, something called Otter's Ransom, which is a very weird story. And I wonder if the translator translated Otto's ransom. It's Otto's Vergeld in Icelandic. Vergeld, I think, in German. In this story, there is a ring which is cursed, and whoever possesses it is going to die. Again, much like the ring in Lord of the Rings, it's passed down from one person to another, and at every step, the person who has the ring is going to find powerful misfortune. Another way that rings appear in Norse mythology is one ring which creates other rings. So there's an elf in Norse mythology who creates a ring for Odin, which every 9 days creates 8 more rings. So just a tiny bit like the idea in the Lord of the Rings that there's one ring to rule them all and that the mortal men have 9 rings, right? So all 3 of these ways that rings appear in Norse mythology, as binding a lord to a subject or a subject to a lord, as being cursed, and also as there being one ring which creates or is superior to other rings, Tolkien combined those 3 themes from Norse mythology to make his story of a ring. Which brings me to these orci. So orc is a funny word. Where does it come from? The word orc, as it appears in Tolkien's Middle-earth, is taken from Beowulf, from the word orkneas, which is a compound of a Latin word and a Germanic word, which means something like an undead wraith, something which is undead, something which is like the living dead, a fiend of hell, that comes straight from Beowulf, which Tolkien himself translated in 1926. And he acknowledged in a letter in the 1950s that this was the source. So Beowulf, again, like the Prose Edda, are the basic written sources for this time and place. Okay, so why am I talking about this in connection to Ukraine? Well, in connection to Kyiv in particular. Because the culture that I'm describing, the myths and stories that I'm describing, are the myths and stories of the people who turned Kyiv into a capital of a country. The exact time, the 8th, 9th, 10th, 11th centuries, when these stories were told and then recorded, is the time when Vikings from Scandinavia took over the city of Kyiv from the Khazars and turned it into a capital. The people who founded Kyiv, the Scandinavians who founded Kyiv, who had names like Helga, who Ukrainians prefer to call Olha, or names like Yaroslav, who Ukrainians prefer to call Yaroslav, right? Those people were Scandinavians, and the culture that they brought was Scandinavian. Kievan Rus was one of several Scandinavian states founded around the year 1000, along with Denmark and Norway and Sweden. It was one of a series of states founded by Vikings, which included Normandy and Sicily, and also indirectly England. So the point here would be that even as Tolkien was conjuring with these words and terms and culture in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, 1,000 years before that, the people whose stories they were, people who actually, when they controlled Kyiv, were giving one another rings to symbolize a relationship between Lord and follower. 1,000 years before Tolkien was writing, those people were actually making the history, along with other people, along with the Khazars, along with the Slavs. But these were the people who turned Kyiv into the capital of a country, who founded the medieval kingdom of Rus, right? So when in the 21st century, someone refers to orcs in the Ukrainian language, it's not an innovation. It's not only at least a borrowing from some kind of globalized culture. It's actually a return. That word is from Beowulf. It's more than 1,000 years old. It belongs to a North European culture, which is, it's not the only influence, but it's very important in the creation of Kyiv. And the return is actually a double return, because the most important story about a ring in the Prose Edda, in Icelandic myth, Otto's ransom. That story actually recalls events from the 3rd, 4th, and 5th centuries AD involving Goths and Huns, and events which took place on the Ukrainian steppe. So the story in Icelandic myth, which Tolkien revives as the Lord of the Rings, actually took place historically on the Ukrainian steppe, on what's now the Ukrainian steppe, in the 3rd, 4th, and 5th centuries, as the first the Goths and then the Huns took over this region from the Scythians. Okay, the Scythians. That brings me to Wonder Woman. So, after having had to introduce the Lord of the Rings, I'm a little worried about whether I also have to introduce Wonder Woman. Like, I wonder whether there are people who are frowning. They're like, who is that? And some of them are sincere, and some of them are just pretending to be cool. And I want you to know I can tell the difference. So, Wonder Woman is a superheroine in American culture. She was created in 1941, late 1941, in a comic book. She underwent a very interesting trajectory in her life in comics. She started as an extraordinarily interesting and radical feminist figure. I'm not even going to say for her time. I would say radical for any time. And if you don't believe me, go back and read those first few years of Wonder Woman. You'll be surprised at what you find. Among the more conventionally feminist things you will find is a section at the end of each Wonder Woman comic book called Wonder Women of History, in which in the early 1940s, Americans were being told about women, American children were being told about women's history. After her creator died in 1947, she then reverted to being a much more passive and predictable figure with a family life. There was then a moment in the late 60s and early 70s where she lost her powers in what was supposed to be a feminist move, but the actual feminists really didn't like it that she lost her powers. You may not know that the first issue of Ms. Magazine, which was the magazine of American second wave feminism, had Wonder Woman on the cover. She's now, after having existed, for more than 70 years, she's now finally being written by female authors, which took a long time to happen, and her founding story has been recreated again. Oh, she's also in movies. Maybe you saw, I realize you don't go to movies like this, but you might have seen that there were movies involving someone called Wonder Woman. Okay. And millions of other people saw them, including me. I watched them so I could give this lecture. And I enjoyed them. So the origins of Wonder Woman at first glance would seem to be all American. What could be more American than someone wearing the stars and stripes, right? What could be more American than a figure who arises in the middle of the Second World War, whose first encounter with America is with an officer of military intelligence who crashes on her island. But when we start to think about her and what she can do, we wonder, okay, maybe American, but what kind of American? So she has this lasso, right? And when she catches you in the lasso, what do you have to do? You have to tell the truth. That's an interesting idea, right? And she has these bracelets which can stop bullets, and she's as fast as Mercury and as strong as 100 men, and all of this. It's an interesting combination, though, that she has of powers, and the combination of powers actually bespeaks, believe it or not, and I'm going to get to the Scythians in a minute, but bespeaks first wave American feminism. There was a milieu who essentially jointly created Wonder Woman. It involves one man and the 2.5 women he lived with, and who were all passionate believers in a version of feminism which said that women ought to be running the world. So it had that first wave feminist view that women are actually better than men in certain ways. And they also held together some interesting ideas about how male freedom tended to be anarchic and destructive. And true freedom involved, I'm putting this really delicately now, submission to love, which were ideas that they acted out together over decades. If you'd like to know more about that, my colleague Jill Lepore, who's an amazing historian at Harvard, wrote an entire book called The Secret History of Wonder Woman, from which I'm drawing this. And her thesis is that, and it's a very convincing thesis, is that Wonder Woman herself was a kind of transition from first wave American feminism in the early 20th century to second wave American feminism in the 60s and 70s. So this man, and the two most important women were Olive Byrne and Elizabeth Holloway, and the man was called William Marston. He was also, not incidentally, the inventor of the lie detector. So the notion that you could be tied up and forced to tell the truth was for him a matter of technology. He invented the technology which is still used for lie detection, which involves blood pressure. So this heroine who wants you to experience loving submission, this heroine who has bracelets, which the bracelets came from one of the two women. They were Olive Byrne's bracelets. This woman who is so clearly American comes from maybe a more interesting America than, maybe a slightly more Berlinish America, right? Than you might have thought existed. These people, they lived a very interesting life. Among other things, Olive Byrne, who was Marston's lover, interviewed him for a magazine called Family Circle. And she wrote article after article in which she interviewed her own lover, but pretended to just be visiting him as a psychologist. And then she would ask him questions about, like, how would you organize a family, right? She even had an article about children, about his two children, who were amazingly well raised, in which she didn't mention that they were also her children. So these three people played a very interesting game with gender and sex, but behind it were interesting ideas about how gender and sex aren't the same thing, and interesting ideas about love and about freedom. Okay, so that would be good enough, right? But I just told you that out of general just what I thought Berliners would be interested in. I thought you'd want to hear about bondage and first wave feminism, so I gave it to you. Yeah. But here's where you now have to pretend to pay attention, right? Because like everybody was writing down like Jill Lepore, Secret History of Wonder Woman. Bondage. But that's not really where the argument is going. Okay, so like, and some of you already ordered the book on Amazon. I saw that too. And you should, because it's an excellent, in all seriousness, it's an excellent work of history. It's a terrific work of history, as well as a great read. But, okay, so Wonder Woman is American, and she's a feminist, at least at the beginning, an extraordinarily interesting feminist, at least at the beginning. But that's not where the story stops. So she's as you will know, she's an Amazon. And that also comes out of American first wave feminism. In the 1900s and 1910s, there was a whole barrage of American fiction which involved islands full of Amazon women who are living happily until a man shows up. And that, as some of you will know, is how the Wonder Woman comic book starts. The Amazons are living on an island, and then an American pilot crash lands, and then that shakes everything up. And one of them ends up taking him back to America, and that's how she becomes Wonder Woman. So she's an Amazon, and Amazons are present in early 20th century American feminist fiction. Okay, fine. In that story, the Amazons are on an island because their queen, Hippolyta, has lost her, what we say in English, her girdle, which was actually her war belt or a bit of her armor. She had lost it to Hercules. So for those of you who follow Greek mythology at all, this might be a familiar story. Heracles does, although how it happens is highly disputed, end up with the girdle of Hippolyta. That's a mythological story. And of course, it invites us to remember that the Amazons are major figures throughout Greek myth. not just the encounter of Heracles with Hippolyta, but the encounter of Achilles and Perithesleia, the encounter of Theseus and Antiope. All of the major heroes of Greek myth have meaningful encounters with female warriors who are called Amazons. And by the way, all three of those figures I just mentioned appear in the new origin story of Wonder Woman as it was recreated a few years ago. And as you'll probably also know, Amazons are very prominent in Greek art in general. We have more than 1,000 Greek vases or pieces of Greek vases which portray Amazons, usually in ever more accurate, as time goes by, Scythian armor and Scythian weaponry. So it's interesting to think about these Greek myths of Amazons because the Greek myths of Amazons have a surprising correspondence to a certain history, the history of the encounter of the Greeks with the Scythians being the people who lived on the southern Ukrainian steppe, as well as in the Caucasus and Central Asia. But the ones the Greeks knew were chiefly from the southern Ukrainian steppe. It's interesting to follow these myths with Heracles and Achilles and Theseus because they seem to follow the arc of the actual historical encounter between the Greeks and the Scythians. It's true that the Scythians pressed on towards Athens, as the myth of Theseus and Antiope says. It's true that there was some diplomatic negotiation, as the myth of Heracles and Hippolyta would suggest. And it's true that Greeks fought Scythians, as in the story of Achilles and Penthesileia. I don't know if you know that story. It's part of the story of the War of Troy, in which a band of Amazons fight on the Trojan side and wreak utter havoc on the Greek side until Achilles finally kills Penthesileia. But all of those things actually happened. The Greeks, of course, did fight Scythians. So it's interesting, right? There's an American myth and it's inside a Greek myth. But it's not a myth. It's a myth that it's a myth. It's a misunderstanding that it's a myth. The art is accurate. There were female Scythian warriors that the Greeks called Amazons. And we now know this as a result of Ukrainian archaeology. This is one of the few things which has been recently, one of the many interesting things about early history, which has been established pretty much this beyond a shadow of a doubt. Why did we think it was a myth? We have all these Greek stories about how their heroes fight women. Why wouldn't we just believe that? We have all this Greek art in which women are portrayed accurately using weapons, including, by the way, a lariat. We have all this Greek art accurately portraying women using weapons. In every single bit of Greek art portraying an Amazon, she is always running towards danger and never away. Every single one. We have all of that evidence. Why would we think that that was a myth? Why would we think it didn't happen? Maybe it said something about us, right? Maybe it said something about us that we would think that we would come to the following conclusion, which we did. The idea was the Greeks had a problem with sex and gender. The male Greeks had a problem with their women, and so they had to fantasize about women who rode horses and fought in wars. That was the idea. That is, until tonight, that was your idea too, so don't laugh at it. That was the idea. That's what we thought. We disregarded all the literary evidence and all of the artistic evidence and the archaeological evidence. Because the archaeological evidence, you know, they're in the Scythian, so we would disinter Scythian graves, and about 1/4 of the warriors, that is the people buried with armor and spears and arrows, and sometimes their horses, were women. But they weren't, but sorry, I got ahead of myself. They weren't women, they were small men. And they were small men, and among the Scythians, there was an unusual pelvic construction among small men. That was the interpretation. That's what we thought for a long time. Because of course there couldn't have been women warriors. Of course the Greeks were just fantasizing about something like that. Could never have happened. Thankfully, there aren't just the Ukrainian archaeologists, an important one is Elena Fialko, who have made these finds. And the finds, by the way, are extraordinary. And they, and pretty much everything else I'm saying, is on the basis of my colleague Adrian Mayor's amazing book on the Amazons. But these discoveries are themselves fantastic, because you'll find a female and she'll have her horse, she'll have 40 arrows, she'll have 2 spears, she'll have a quiver for her arrows, which is made of leather and wood and painted. But she might also have her mirror and her comb, right? Which, suggests that maybe you can have it all. But so the men also were buried with their, just to be clear, the men were also buried with their mirrors and their combs. And they also had long hair. And they also fought. I don't want to give the wrong impression. The Scythian men also fought. They didn't just stay at home and say, okay, dear, let me know how it goes. It's not like the 21st century. Okay. But so we know this not just because of the archaeological finds. We know it because of the technology. So we're now capable of doing many things with ancient DNA technology. And one of the things we can do is we can tell women from men. And so this door is now closed. It's now certain these were women. So this undoes, a lot of the ways that we were thinking about gender in the 20th century. And interestingly, the apparently wild way that William Marston and his friends, lovers, wife were thinking about gender turns out to be historically more accurate, crazy though it seems. The Amazon that they invented, this Wonder Woman, was apparently based in a myth, but she was in fact based in history. And it's a history, and you've already gotten this point, right? It's a history which actually took place in Ukraine. In Ukraine, precisely. That's where the evidence of it is. And the Scythians, including the female Scythian warriors, known as Amazons, that the Greeks encountered would have been predominantly from what is now Ukraine. So this is my really gentle conclusion. I was thinking about this too when I was standing in Kherson Oblast on these farms, because I was in deoccupied territory, and of course Ukrainian territory, which has been deoccupied by women as well as men. And I was thinking about, and I was close to some of these archaeological sites where Amazons, that is to say Scythian female warriors, had been disinterred. And I was thinking about how future archaeologists, when they come to these same places, will also find the remains of female warriors as well as men. And I was also thinking about, the main point that I made, which is like the gifts, right? The things that you have to know how to receive. There's a funny thing about Old Indo-European, the language which apparently came from Ukraine, Proto-Indo-European, which is that there was no distinction between guest and host. Also ghost, they were all one word. In English, if you're an English speaker, the distinction between guest and host is very great because we have a very poor hospitality culture. In Ukrainian, it's much closer. There's still a little slippage between who's the guest and who's the host, and there's a much more robust hospitality culture. But that the word for ghost was also once the same word, right? That also is suggestive, because how could it be the same word? Because in pagan cultures, the dead also do things around the house. You're also in a reciprocal relationship with people who are dead. And gifts can be brought by our friends who are alive, but they can also be brought by others, right? That's a basic principle, not just of culture, but also of history and of trying to understand the past. But of course, the question then remains open, like now that we know that these fables are actually in some sense true, or now that we know that these fables depend upon events which actually took place, now that we know that some of our basic entertainments depended on real people doing real things a long time ago, what do you do with that, right? I mean, I'm not going to tell you, but one suggestion would be, it's not so crazy to think that people who love might also fight. Or, which is of course the Wonder Woman story. Or it's not so crazy to think, and this is the Icelandic story, this is the Viking story, this is the Norse story. It's not so crazy to think that even if it all will come to an end someday, you should still destroy the ring. That's the end. Bye.
Yeah, please. Thanks so much, team, for this beautiful lecture. So please, we still have some time for Q&A. Just raise your hand, and I will be, or perhaps my colleague will be assisting with a microphone. And if possible, just let's keep it like questions. And would be good if you could also present yourself or introduce yourself.
Test. I'm Ukrainian. I guess that's it. I will be quick. I was listening to him speaking at the beginning, and I was thinking myself that he speaks some sort of dead language that we don't use in a daily life. And I was thinking that it's this kind of like bureaucratic, institutional, maybe old German language in that sense, and artists from Ukraine or in general, or there's a certain big struggle against this over-bureaucratization of the creative industries. And what do you think would be the more ethical or approach to how the artists, from the perspective of your lecture, should approach this notion of Europe that, hey, we have, for example, Goethe Institute, we have some funds for you, we want to give you money, so you will feel yourself a part of this European, some sort of institutional circus in a way. And is there for you a certain challenge in how to marry these two words, institutions and pure art? Thanks.
Yeah, I mean that's a really beautiful question, and I appreciate your kind word about Vasil's introduction, because I think you've caught something very important, which is the attempt to use words to spread a sense of responsibility, as opposed to the attempt to use words to defer responsibility. So that may not have been exactly the distinction you're trying to make, but that's how it seems to me. That seems to me to be very important. You know, when I think not just you're criticizing cultural institutions or asking about them, but there's a larger issue here about European and American rhetoric. Are we using words to take or to disperse responsibility? Are we using words to exemplify responsibility, or are we using words to undermine it? So for me, the most important category is responsibility, and which is a fruitful word because it means, you know, it includes responsiveness, it includes a response, it includes a kind of mutual interaction, but at the end of the day, it has an unavoidable moral character involving me. I'm responsible, at least a little bit. I'm responsible. So I may not have a better answer than the one that I already gave, which is, in order to receive gifts, you have to recognize them as gifts. And I think a couple of gifts which I try to receive are risk. So not that I want people to be at risk, right? Not that I want my friends to be wounded or die. Not that I want them, but people who are at risk, who are taking risk or taking different risks than me, they have a gift which they're giving whether they want to or not. It's there, and it's up to me to understand that. And I think most of us, probably many of us in this room, but many of us in the West could work on that. Like, and I don't, by the way, just mean Ukrainians. I also mean other people in our societies, right? And then a second thing would be neighborhood. So I was making a non-global point, like a non-globalized point in my lecture, which is that there is something about countries that are close to you, which you may not have noticed and which may be essential to your own culture. And maybe in ways you like, maybe in ways you don't like. So that the same story, Otter's Ransom, Alters Vergil, or whatever it is also the basis, as you will know, or of Wagner's Ring Cycle, right? So a bit of German culture, which is indispensably central, whatever you think of it, comes from the same place, and that physical place is the Ukrainian steppe. Not that Wagner was thinking about that, but nevertheless, it's true, right? And so there are, what I've been thinking about a lot in this war is how these German or French or English or American references that we kind of pile up into a linear story, which we think we know, how that linear story might not be true, or how there are other lines that come in and cross. And in particular with Ukraine, I realize I'm not exactly answering your question, but it got me thinking. In particular with Ukraine, I think we, this is a Berlin we, and a Paris we, and a London we, and a New York we. I think we have a hard time looking at it because it's so important. Like Ukraine is really important to what Germany did and became in the 20th century, but we don't necessarily look at it. And I think Ukraine is really central to what we might be in the 21st century. And that also makes it hard to look at. We would kind of prefer that, we be the center of things and, we be comfortable. So I'm afraid I haven't answered your question about institutional language. I've just kind of celebrated the distinction that that you're making. But I think you're onto something.
Please.
Hello, Mr. Snyder. My name is Albert. I'm a composer. I'm from Ukraine. And, I think there's an echo. Okay. So first of all, I would like to thank you so much for doing the thing you have been doing, researching the history of my country, and for doing that for such a long time, long before I've started, I've learned about you and about the things you do. I actually learned about you when the war has already, the full-scale invasion has already started, and your lectures brought a lot of meaning to my life, and I know that to the life of many of my co-citizens. And now my question is, I will try to make it short. I'm really curious to get to know your view as a historian on this issue that is kind of, present here as we are now in Berlin, which is culture and Russian culture versus Ukrainian culture, and this whole question of whether culture should be banned or not in the times of war, whether culture is an issue that is sometimes, culture is a thing that might be used as a weapon, and maybe like a representative of a country which is aggressive should maybe be left without a voice for some time. I'm oversimplifying, of course, and the other side of the spectrum, again oversimplified, is like the voices and the thoughts I hear is that, well, the individual is individual, and a person cannot be held accountable for the deeds of their state. Therefore, we should kind of provide voices to everyone. I hope I made my question understandable, mostly because you've probably heard things like that. So yeah, thank you.
Ви безобільно говорили англійською мовою, якщо хто хотів би ставити питання українською, це теж в порядку. So I think I know what you meant. I think I have three things to say. The first is that let me start with what you said about giving everyone a voice. So there was and you'll have to forgive me because I'm in culture mode now. So Euripides wrote a drama called Iphigenia in Taurus. We say Iphigenia in Taurus in English, auf Taurus, I think, in German, which is maybe the most interesting Greek drama of them all, in part because it is about Scythians and about a woman. And it's the only Greek drama, if I'm not mistaken, or major one, in which the woman actually takes control of the action and determines what happens in the end. And the reason I'm thinking of it is that I happen to think that that story is bound up in the confrontation with different ways of having gender that the Scythians posed to the Greeks. But also because Euripides had something very intelligent to say about freedom of speech, which I think is correct. Euripides thought that you have freedom of speech in order to speak truth to power. That's what it's for. That's why we protect it. And the reason we have to protect it is that truth is dangerous, especially when spoken to power. And therefore we have a right to free speech, or therefore we should protect each other when we speak freely, because truth is dangerous and because power is dangerous. And so the reason I'm saying this is that when we enter into this field of who has a voice, not everybody is speaking truth to power. So Vladimir Putin is not speaking truth to power. Prater Galerie is not speaking truth to power. Elon Musk is not speaking truth to power. Donald Trump is not speaking truth to power. There's a whole coterie of extremely wealthy and, let's say, idiosyncratic individuals and companies that control a huge amount of what's said and what we have to deal with, who are lying with power. And so it may be that there's no way to construct a law about freedom of speech which protects you and doesn't protect Elon Musk. But nevertheless, as reasonable people, as moral people, we should see the difference between a Ukrainian writing a poem in a trench and a Russian oligarch deciding what's going to be said on a television channel, right? And so I think it's reasonable to make that difference. How the policy then rolls out, I'm not going to go into details, but in general, I would be strongly in favor of policies which make it easier for people to find things out for themselves and to hear difficult truths. And I would be in favor of policies which make it harder to monopolize conversation space, whether that's by television or whether that's by social media. And so, I think it's reasonable in time of war and not in time of war to say there's a media institution which is telling lies all the time for malicious purposes owned by extremely wealthy people. Maybe we should allow our conversation space to move somewhere else. I don't think there's a problem with that. So I forgot the first question. What was the first question? Was that it? That was it? Okay.
Hi, my name is Jen. Thank you so much for your talk. It was really interesting. And by the way, I'm this one person who doesn't know a thing about rings and hobbits and all.
Now you do, though.
Yeah, I do now. Maybe you can do Harry Potter next time.
I have an entire lecture about the political morality of Harry Potter.
I'm gonna buy this
and it
book
is
now.
And it's online. Okay. So, ha.
I have a very practical political question, I think. Do you think that in order to imagine a solidarity for the future between, for example, Germany and Ukraine, or to imagine a solidarity in a European future, do we rely on this shared, maybe hidden history that you just pointed out? Do we need to know about this history, and do we have maybe other means to create solidarity if we can't rely on this, on those facts that you just mentioned?
So yes, I mean, I'm going to make the basic point that I think the future solidarity of inside the European Union depends on what you do now. So the history of 2024 is going to, much as I might love it, it's going to be more important than the history of the year 1000. And the history of 2024 is still to be made. And I think I mean this not in a banal way. I think that you Europeans are in a, 1939 to 1945 type moment where it's very important how things turn out, but it's also important to be on the right side. And I do think there's a right side in this case, just as I think there was a right side in 1939 to 1945. And this has specific relevance to the European Union because the European Union is based on the Second World War, which is a long time ago. And I think it would be better to have, or to put it more strongly, I think it's necessary to have another moment, a more recent one, perhaps even one which involves fewer Americans, where Europeans did the right thing and expressed solidarity and won. The winning part is important. Winning is very important. As far as, but I want to say that I think there are very many ways to find solidarity, which I think is a really important word. And one of the things I like about history is that it serves, I think, both a kind of defensive and a creative function. So the defensive function is something like, at least I hope you can please humor me and nod when I say this, but I think when you realize how interesting history is, like when you realize that those people who turned Podil into a port and took control of Kyiv were involved in a culture which is the same culture that led to the Lord of the Rings. I know you don't care, but other people will. Or when you realize that, that American superheroine could never have existed without these Greek myths, but the Greek myths aren't myths, they're true, and they involve women who rode horses and could turn around backwards and fire arrows and kill men. When you realize that life is rich like that, that the past is rich like that the past has untold riches with always more connections than you think, then stupid ethnic stories, no matter whose they are, whether they're Russian or Ukrainian or Polish or German, the stupid ethnic stories about how we are we and we were always we and they're them and we were always innocent. Because that's the structure of it every time. It's always we were innocent and they were guilty. There's no ethnic nationalism which says we're guilty and they're innocent, right? It's always the same stupid story. That stories like that, although of course they're going to be tempting because everybody likes to be innocent, the stories like that they'll seem uninteresting. They'll seem false, right? So history has a kind of defensive quality, I think. I mean, when we're confronted with people like Slobodan Milosevic or Vladimir Putin, or what's that guy's name who's the governor of Florida? Oh yeah, DeSantis. We were confronted with people like that who tell or want to tell really simplified stories. Often the response is, well, doesn't that mean history is a bad thing? Look, the past is dangerous. And that's not what I think at all. I think it's that we have to have a lot more history. It has to be more artfully done, and it has to involve, more of us. But then there's also there's a defensive function, and then there's also the creative function, that it can help us to see how we're connected. In fact, right? I mean, in fact, it matters that I'm speaking the Indo-European language. I speak a bunch of languages, but they're all Indo-European. I mean, they all come back to people who came out of the Ukrainian and the South Russian steppe. Apparently, they all go back to those people. That's true. That's a connection between me and you, right? It's a connection between me and everybody who speaks Hindi, which I bet a lot of you didn't know about before tonight. I didn't know about it until pretty recently too. And so history can serve, like, I think it's the unexpected connections which are interesting, right? Because solidarity isn't a kind of mechanical thing. It's when you sort of recognize people you didn't know you were going to recognize, and you're constantly creating new ways of recognizing people that you've become good at solidarity. So I think history prepares us for that. And that's the creative function.
Hi, my name, does it work? My name is Olga. Thank you. The lecture was absolutely delightful. I didn't know there are more ways of putting Ukraine once again in the center of the history. And in one of your previous lectures, if I remember it correctly, you compared Ukraine to the heart of the darkness. And once again, there is this motive that when you're in the epicenter of something huge and magnificent like that, it's dark and it's invisible. So my question is, how do we as a nation, how do we as Ukrainian people of culture and many other ways make invisible visible? Thank you.
So, again, because we're in a cultural setting, I just get to indulge myself and make lots of references. I don't have to talk about power right away. Heart of Darkness is, of course, a title of a very important anti-colonial novel by Joseph Conrad. And Heart of Darkness is essentially Hannah Arendt's main source for part 3 of Origins of Totalitarianism. Her views about Europeans in Africa largely arise from one short novel by an English novelist, Conrad. The thing about Conrad is that, as you all know, right, he was Polish. And so people think, aha, well, the reason, Joseph Conrad was such an important anti-imperial novelist is because of the Poles and the Russians. But that's not correct, I don't think. The reason that I think he understood colonialism was because he understood the history of Polish colonialism in Ukraine. And it's he, I think, who actually embodies and first makes this connection between Ukraine and Africa, which Hitler makes, and which Arendt notices, and which is so very important for the actual history of Ukraine, that Hitler thought of Eastern Europe in general, but Ukraine in particular, as being not like the actual Africa, but as being like an Africa to be colonized, and that the people in Ukraine were colonial people. So I just wanted to make the Heart of Darkness reference clear before I said anything else. And I think I think Ukraine really is unusual in this way, that its centrality makes us uncomfortable, I think. Its centrality makes us uncomfortable. Like when I give, like there are basic things about Ukraine, which, I'm still discovering, like the cities. If you check anything on the internet after you leave tonight, I want you to check my claim that Ukraine has the oldest cities, because nobody in this room knew that, including the Ukrainians. And it looks, you see the Ukrainians are honest. They're like, yes, I did not know that. Whereas the Germans are like, wenn es wirklich alt ist, dann wusste ich schon. I'm sorry. But okay, where was I, Olga? Where was I? Oh, so I think the centrality makes us uncomfortable. Like it makes other people, and we tend to find ways to tell the story without Ukraine, and whatever the story is, whether it's the ancient history, whether it's classical history, it's without Ukraine. A really striking, for me, like I live sometimes in Vienna, and there's a painting in the Kunst Museum called this, I think it's called The Medien of the Scythians and the Amazons or something like that, by a Dutch painter called, I think, Van Veet, from 1597 or so. And it shows these it shows these naked, like these beautiful naked white women, and a pile of armor. And the funny thing about this painting was, for a long time, no one could figure out what it was. Like, how could there be women in armor? Like, what would women be doing with what? And of course, that what the women would have been taking off the armor in order to become naked. It's like, that's as clear as day, right? But you see what the, anyway, okay. So that's the first funny thing about this painting. It's like, obviously they're Amazons, they've taken off their armor, that's why they're naked, right? But it took years to interpret this. But then once you even know what it is, you think, okay, this painting is about a Greek myth, right? This never happened. There were never actual Amazons having actual sex. Like, that never happened. It's a myth. It's a beautiful Greek myth, which has then been rescued for us in the beautiful West in this beautiful painting. That's as far as you would go, like, in watching and looking at that art. No one going to the Kunsthistorisches Museum looks at that painting and says, that is a historical event which happened on the Ukrainian steppe, right? No one, literally nobody. I mean, now you're all going to do it. The next time in Vienna, you're going to be like, let me guide you through. Look at this Dutch painter. But it's for me, like, it's an example of how, like, we take a we have a trajectory, and we kind of hold it all to ourselves, and we lose the place, right? Whereas Ukrainians, I'm not going to answer your question, I'm just going to kind of set it up again, but Ukrainians have to inhabit the place. Like, we can look away from it in our various ways, but you have to inhabit it, and inhabiting it means, for the last several years, several hundred years, I mean, from the 16th to the 20th centuries, let's say, it involves inhabiting a place where other people really want the land for imperial reasons. And since the 16th century, and the Poles, and then the Russians, and then later the Nazis and the Soviets, these have been large, powerful realms who are in some way empowered by globalization to be concerned with your land, right? So up until the 16th century or so, Ukrainian history doesn't involve empires so much, interestingly. But after the 16th century, it really does. And that's not a coincidence. It's because the 16th century is the beginning of the age of discovery, the age of empire. And from that point on, the people who are trying to conquer Ukraine are being empowered by much larger territories in their hinterland in some way or another. So you have to live in this territory, which people like to look away from, except when they're trying to take it. And that's, I think, like, that's, going back to your question about trying to say things directly, like the thing that I just said, I think if like we accept that like it's something we look away from, except when we're trying to take it, then we can then people who are not Ukrainian can at least start to understand themselves a little bit better. And then maybe at least we can start to have a conversation. I can't answer for you directly how Ukrainians should think about, their own country. I can't do that. All I can do is, like, set things up a little bit. Oh, and by the way, I mean, Olha, right? Like, when Olha baptized, probably in 959, she took the name Helen, right? But her Scandinavian name was Helga. Boom. They all had three names. Isn't that cool? They had three names. They had their Scandinavian name, they had their baptismal name, they had their Slavic name for a while, the men and the women, right? And that's the kind of thing which once you remember, if you always remember Olha was also Helena or Helen, and Olha was also Helga, then you're suddenly in connection with a whole bunch of other traditions. And that's how we should be.
Yeah, thanks so much. I think we have to wrap it up here, especially having an anti-colonial note at the end. So thank you so much, Tim, again. Yeah, always a pleasure to listen to you. And yeah, thanks so much for coming. And we hope to see all of you in a week at the opening of the exhibition next Friday.